December night in Panama, a foreign army closes in. Modern soldiers prepare to exercise authority, using overwhelming force. A century of deal-making by politicians, spies, and citizens have led to this moment. Powerful leaders play the hands dealt to them by those who have come before. But the game nears its end. The seeds of war, dormant for an age, sprout with deadly consequence. These are the events that shape our world. These are the leaders that risk it all. These are the final moments before war. This is Edge of War.
In a climate of political instability, desperate citizens will often support the leader or the foreign power that can provide order and authority in the least amount of time. This type of political compromise is precisely how military leaders and puppet governments rise to power. It's been happening since the birth of nations. Military men take action where politicians debate. They bring strength and decisiveness to statecraft, whereas democracy requires time and deliberation. But the military is seldom trained or institutionally capable of governing democratically. So democracy itself is often one of the many virtues sacrificed for the short-term order and prosperity that a military regime might provide. Sometimes the obligation to provide stability compels outside intervention, and sometimes that intervention takes the form of open war.
Panama, December 20th, 1989. The United States military deploys in force. Their mission? Remove dictator Manuel Noriega from power. Through corruption and vicious oppression, General Noriega, an American friend turned foe, has firm control over the small Central American Republic, a key U.S. trading route. These soldiers are the vanguard of the most powerful and technologically advanced military the world has ever seen.
This was one of the most complex plans in American history. Definitely the most complex I had ever seen.
Called Operation Just Cause, the invasion's objective is to capture Noriega, neutralize the Panama Defense Forces, and transfer power to a democratic civilian government.
27 separate targets needed to be secured, and the forces were in motion so that all of them went down either at 1 a.m. or shortly thereafter.
Facing the speed and might of the U.S. military, the overwhelmed and underprepared Panama Defense Forces don't stand much of a chance.
We were supposed to take down the Panamanian targets, but not the Panamanian people.
The folks that we were fighting were using our equipment imported from the United States. These are potential allies. It's almost be careful of what you're asking for, because allies can very quickly turn to be enemies.
American helicopters and stealth bombers hammer Panama's main airfields, including the Rio Hato airfield, where Noriega has a residence and a possible escape route. From the skies above, airborne rangers drop onto their softened targets. Neutralizing air access in and out of Panama is one of the most immediate objectives. At the Torrijos-Tocumen Airport, the airborne troops land and secure the PDF Air Force compound and the International Terminal building.
They wanted to jump on the airfield when there would be no civilians around. Unfortunately, that night, one of the planes came in late, and there were still over 300 civilians when they attacked the terminal. When they went to clear the terminal, several small firefights broke out.
By 5 a.m., the Torrijos-Tocumen Airport is secure and civilians are safe. 11 miles to the southeast, Navy SEALs in an amphibious assault seek to secure the Patia airfield and disable Noriega's private jet. This time, PDF soldiers stand and fight, putting up fierce resistance.
The SEALs move up the runway to take out the airplane, but come under machine gun fire from an unexpected angle. Takes them a while to win that firefight, but then they were able to come up and disable Noriega's jet.
The airfield is taken and secured. Escape by air is no longer an option for Noriega. Throughout the night, reports pour in of objectives falling like clockwork. On the Atlantic side, Fort Espinar, Madden Dam, and the Electrical Distribution Center at Cerro Tigre. On the Pacific side, the PDF Engineers Compound, Balboa Harbor, and the Arahan Fuel Depot are secured. The 6th Marine Expeditionary Battalion takes the Bridge of the Americas, connecting both sides of the Panama Canal. By sunrise, resistance at the PDF headquarters in Panama City tapers off, and a secure perimeter is put in place. Within 6 hours, American forces capture most of their primary objectives and all of Panama's major airports and access points, with only 16 killed in action.
It was David versus Goliath, a completely overawing U.S. military with all its latest technologies against a relatively small Panamanian military.
For American military leaders, it's too early to know how many PDF fighters remain in the battle. What is clear is that many Panamanian officers desert, leaving their troops spread out, leaderless, and unable to coordinate. Across the country, terrified Panamanian civilians flee to safety, unsure of what the coming days will bring. So far, Manuel Noriega is nowhere to be found. Who is Manuel Noriega, and why is he a target of U.S. forces? The illegitimate son of a Panamanian laundress, Noriega attends a military academy, then enlists in the Panamanian Army, and begins moving up the ranks.
The CIA was looking for assets to wield against communism in Central and South America, and along comes Manuel Noriega, this ambitious, rising, talented officer in the Panamanian National Guard, and the CIA grabbed him.
In the late 1960s, Manuel Noriega becomes one of the CIA's most important assets in the region, while simultaneously climbing the ranks of the Panamanian military as an intelligence officer.
Noriega was expert at navigating the very complex social relations of Panama between the wealthy, privileged people and the poor underclass. He knew both worlds, operated in both worlds. In the early years after his intelligence and counterintelligence training in the U.S., he was making about $100,000 a year from the U.S. government. That sum was eventually doubled.
Panama was the Casablanca of Central America. Revolutionary groups from several countries in Latin America had a presence and even maybe headquarters. They were doing arms trafficking back and forth. Noriega was giving them a haven, but at the same time, he was facilitating the United States keeping track of these people, allowing the United States to spy on them. There were wiretaps set up. There were bugs put in hotel rooms. It was quite a place.
By 1983, as his usefulness to U.S. intelligence grows, Noriega's extra-legal activities go largely ignored. His arrogance and disregard for Panamanian law facilitates his rise to power.
General Noriega decided to transform his National Guard into a modern military with good equipment and good training, with encouragement of the U.S. authorities. Ironically, this would come back to haunt us because he would create a strong enough force to create trouble for us in Central America.
The Panamanian Defense Force ran everything from traffic cops and park rangers all the way to special operations units. But the key thing was that unlike a Western Army or the United States, Noriega maintained total control with himself as the supreme leader.
It's a risky move for power and personal glory. Panama's economic and military importance to the U.S. means Noriega's push puts his people in America's crosshairs. A deadly position nearly 100 years in the making.
Historically, the foreign policy of any nation, its goals, strategies, and means further defines its own national interests. With the rise of world powers, these far-reaching interests can influence the social, economic, and daily life of entire regions of the globe. Since colonial times, South and Central American governments have regularly been caught up in the policies and interests of more powerful nations. In many cases, these relationships have been defined by treaties and become the focus of ardent nationalists on both sides of the agreement, as with Panama and the United States. Since the 19th century, the United States has recognized the strategic and economic importance of Panama. Beyond strategic investments and defense treaties, over 3/4 of a century of work together bound these two nations. All of this comes to a head with the American invasion of Panama, the largest offensive action by U.S. forces since the Vietnam War. The spectacle of war often overshadows the drama at the root of the conflict. These roots are built on the legacies of regimes that have come before, so the complexity of any one conflict can be difficult to unravel. Close study of history is a critical step for those seeking a proper understanding of current events. Similarly, today's politicians must consider the eventual impact of their decisions on the future, for they too will one day be scrutinized by those peering into the past, seeking explanations.
December 1989. General Manuel Noriega, leader of Panama and head of the Panama Defense Forces, is a man on the run. Tensions between Noriega and the United States have reached a boiling point, and in a shockwave of military might, American ground and airborne troops invade and capture targets across Panama. This is the final chapter of a conflict that starts 9 decades earlier, when a well-known American Army colonel named Theodore Roosevelt arrives at the White House. Roosevelt pursues an aggressive foreign policy of military dominance and interventionism, like many leaders of the era.
All of the great powers, Great Britain, France, Germany, the United States, had big battle fleets. They were all wrestling for control, even in the Western Hemisphere.
Roosevelt needs a fast and reliable way to shuttle his Navy between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And it's no secret that attempts are being made to build a canal across Central America.
Teddy Roosevelt was not the kind of president to just sort of sit on his hands.
The Central American Canal would allow the United States to have a two-ocean navy, and would also allow the United States to expand its commerce both between the East and West coasts, but also with Asia and Europe.
It became incumbent upon the U.S. to finance and build a canal across Panama, but because Panama was a province of Colombia at the time, President Roosevelt had to do a deal with the Colombians to get this done.
Securing congressional support, Roosevelt sets his sights on selling his idea to the Colombians, only to be turned down.
When Teddy Roosevelt learned that the Colombians had rejected the treaty, he became very, very angry, called the Colombians names, and swore he was never going to deal with them again.
Roosevelt is stubborn, resourceful, and won't take no for an answer. He knows that a French engineering firm is trying and failing to construct the canal, so he contacts them.
The French company is trying to unload its operations, and so the head of the company, Philippe Benovaria, travels to Washington and meets with President Roosevelt in an attempt to have the United States build a canal in Panama.
But now Varia arrives at the White House with a bold plan. He asks Roosevelt to back a revolution. If Panama is an independent nation, he argues, the Colombians are out of the equation, and Roosevelt can take control of the waterway.
Roosevelt understood that the conspiracy for Panama to declare its independence from Colombia was not legal from the United States standpoint, because we had a treaty to guarantee Colombia's sovereignty over the isthmus. However, he was so angry at the Colombians and so anxious to get the canal started that he looked the other way and the conspiracy went forward.
November 1903, a revolution begins in the province of Panama. While the Panamanians proclaim their independence, a U.S. warship, the USS Nashville, steams into action in the port of Colón.
The Colombians sent troops via ships to put down the revolt, but the presence of U.S. gunships prevented all but a handful of Colombian troops from landing, and those who did were bought off.
With the Colombians out of the picture, U.S. Marines remain in Panama, protecting American interests. A treaty is drafted, giving Roosevelt the right to administer, indefinitely and on both sides of the canal, a sovereign strip of U.S. territory.
The Panamanians had to accept the treaty. The threat was that if they didn't accept it, the United States would withdraw its military and allow the Colombians to recapture the isthmus, and that would have been hanging to many of these Panamanians. So they had to swallow their pride and live by it, but for the next 70 years, that treaty was an original sin.
Construction of the Panama Canal begins anew in 1904. Roosevelt's great dream takes 10 more years to realize. Opened August 15, 1914, the Panama Canal is hailed as the newest wonder of the modern world. For decades, U.S. interests in the new nation are served without question or issue. In the 1960s, the Panamanian outcry against foreign occupation begins to boil. Citizens take to the streets, demanding the end of Washington's less than subtle influence in Panamanian affairs. It's not until the mid-70s that the call for Panamanian freedom reaches a sympathetic ear.
Well, Jimmy Carter is the first post-Vietnam president, and he comes to office with a very progressive international agenda. He wants to end a lot of these rancid relationships with police states. He wants to get rid of colonial vestiges like the Panama Canal. So he sits down with the president of Panama, Omar Torrijos, and negotiates this treaty that will basically get rid of the Panama Canal, pass it over to the Panamanians by the year 2000.
Panamanians celebrate the news, while the American media explodes with criticism and controversy.
It was considered downright reckless to pass control of this vital asset to a country like Panama, which it was commonly assumed would not be able to defend it properly.
In the 70s, the United States had tremendous assets in Panama. We had the canal itself. There were tens of thousands of American troops, maybe 60,000 troops at one time. The bases were in turn training troops from all over Latin America and Central America. It was one of the largest military presence of the United States all over the world.
1980, Ronald Reagan masterminds a landslide victory over Jimmy Carter, becoming the 40th president of the United States. Reagan's opposition to the Panama Canal Treaty is well known. 6 months later, under mysterious circumstances, Torrijos' plane goes down in the Panamanian jungle, killing the main architect of Panama's new treaty. A political void opens in Panama, sending the country into 2 more years of labor unrest, protests, and instability. Throughout the ongoing struggle, Manuel Noriega, the CIA's man on the inside, jockeys for power. He strengthens his connections with powerful South American drug lords, accumulates personal wealth, and still maintains close relations with his friends in the U.S. One of Noriega's more influential American associates is his old CIA handler and current vice president to Ronald Reagan, George Bush.
George H.W. Bush had a very tight relationship with Manuel Noriega. Noriega was Bush's window into Central American politics, war, and the drug trade.
The Drug Enforcement Administration appreciated Noriega because he was helping in the drug trafficking war. Although he himself was a drug trafficker, the critics argued he was simply turning in his competitors to the DEA, but they appreciated it.
Noriega accumulates more and more political clout because of his growing personal wealth, because of his intelligence background, so he's got information on everybody who matters in Panama.
Noriega takes over the National Guard, reorganizes it into the Panama Defense Forces, becomes a general, solidifies his political control, and becomes the new strongman of Panama.
1983, Noriega assumes military control of Panama. Washington welcomes Noriega's stated goal of not interfering in government affairs. The Reagan administration sees a Noriega-led Panama as the key to reasserting American influence and power in the region. But Noriega's appetite for double-dealing, more wealth, and more power will see America's plan blow up.
The late 20th century is a tragic and unstable period for much of Central America. It's a time filled with heavy-handed motions of superpowers and the quiet work of spies and statesmen. By the 1980s, long, bloody insurgencies are underway in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, fed not only by social and economic injustice, but also by assistance from abroad. The hot actions of the Cold War still grip much of the Western Hemisphere. It's on this stage that CIA operative, double agent, international drug runner, and newest dictator of Panama, Manuel Noriega, makes his play for wealth and power. The new dictator is a questionable custodian of Panama. His ties with drug cartels and subversive movements are unsettling, and Noriega's personal ambition sounds warning bells in the U.S. intelligence community. With over 10,000 American civilians living inside the Canal Zone, the stakes are high. For the U.S. gamble to pay off in Panama, Noriega must move steadily away from the dark side and open his nation to increasing democratization and the rule of law. But Noriega turns the other way, consolidating his power, squeezing his detractors, using the black arts of espionage, threats, and coercion. He increasingly alienates Panama's own citizens. With international legal responsibilities for the safety and security of the Panama Canal, the U.S. tries diplomacy and consultation. Despite these efforts, day by day, Noriega's corruption grows greater, his actions more erratic. The deteriorating situation in Panama is an ever-deepening challenge to the leadership in the United States, torn between its critics on the left, who favor a complete and rapid military disengagement from the region, and its critics on the right, who see the demon of communism behind every aspiring nationalist politician.
By 1983, one of the most influential men in Central America is Panama's new dictator, Manuel Noriega. His secret work for the CIA and for others, including the Colombian Medellin drug cartel, earns him some important and powerful allies.
And during that time, there's a tremendous historical irony. George H.W. Bush, Noriega's old CIA handler, is now running a vice presidential task force inside the Reagan administration, which is pledged to stamp out the flow of drugs from Latin America into the U.S. Talk about the inmates running the asylum.
The deeper Noriega sinks into the world of international drug smuggling, the more vital he becomes to his North American friends. Many Panamanians are incensed by Noriega's oppressive rule and his support by the U.S. government, but few dare to speak out against the brutal dictator, and those that do so at their own peril. In the fall of 1985, Panamanian political activist Hugo Spatafora announces he's returning from exile to confront Noriega in the political ring.
Hugo Spatafora was a vocal and charismatic critic of Noriega. When Spatafora, living in exile in Costa Rica, crossed over into Panama, he was detained by the PDF, and the next time he was seen, it was his decapitated body in a U.S. mail bag. Noriega usually used intimidation. He would have someone arrested, incarcerated, he would have them tortured, but very rarely would he kill them, as in the case of Spatafora.
The brutal killing of rival Hugo Spatafora exposes Noriega's ruthless methods to the world. Nervous politicians in the United States begin to worry about their well-known ties to the dictator. In 1987, Reagan is forced to change his stance and take action. He tells Noriega to establish a civilian government and threatens stiff sanctions if he does not comply. The general does not blink. He stands in defiance of the American president.
No hay otro! No hay otro!
So Reagan threatens to cut off Panama's military and economic aid. Through the media, he transforms America's vision of Manuel Noriega.
For the Reagan administration, Noriega had suddenly become too hot to handle. All people inside the administration and the media wanted to talk about was his tyranny, his crime, his corruption, and his connections to the drug cartels.
The spotlight is on Noriega now. He's a drug trafficker. He cuts off people's heads and tortures people. He's a violator of human rights.
In February of 1988, the Reagan administration lands a decisive blow as two grand juries in Florida charge Manuel Noriega with felony crimes. Charging a foreign head of state with drug smuggling and money laundering is an unprecedented political move. But in the eyes of the American public, Noriega is now a wanted man. Noriega fights back, launching a campaign of fear and harassment on the tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers and civilians living inside the Canal Zone, threatening lives and livelihoods. An early victim of Noriega's campaign of intimidation is American Kurt Muse. After his family's print shop is burned to the ground, he decides to fight back. Using smuggled equipment, he sets up a mobile radio station called The Voice of Liberty and broadcasts clandestine messages denouncing Noriega's regime. Finding Muse and stopping his broadcasts is a top priority for Noriega. With the help of expert technicians from Cuba, Muse's radio signals are triangulated and tracked, leading to his arrest. Kurt Muse finds himself behind bars, locked up in the Carcel Modelo prison in Panama City. January 20th, 1989. Ronald Reagan's term as president ends, and the new commander-in-chief is former Vice President George H.W. Bush.
While he was a candidate for president, George H.W. Bush wanted to keep the lid on the crisis in Panama so that his relationship with Noriega would not become a campaign issue. After he was elected president and took the oath of office, he was determined to resolve the crisis.
Bush gives his old agent one last chance. In May, a presidential election in Panama is taking place, and Bush insists that Noriega keeps his hands out of the democratic process. Yet just months earlier, Bush secretly approves Panama 4, a plan that allocates $20 million to back Guillermo Endara, the anti-Noriega candidate. When Noriega discovers Bush's betrayal, he is furious. He cancels the elections, and Endara and his supporters are assaulted in the streets.
Prior to the Panamanian elections, the assumption in Washington and in Panama was that Noriega would steal the election. With that in mind, the United States began drafting plans for how to respond to such an event, and those plans included sending in additional U.S. troops.
Bush deploys an additional 1,900 troops into the Canal Zone, ordering them to push back against Noriega's use of force and intimidation.
In the summer of 1989, the White House and the Pentagon changed the Southcom commander. They do this as a way of signaling to Noriega that the policy of the United States has changed.
Hoping to force Noriega to back down, Bush appoints General Maxwell Thurman as the new commander of U.S. forces in Latin America. Thurman's reputation as an aggressive leader precedes him. The general's first job is to refine existing contingency plans for the invasion of Panama and move troops into position in case an invasion is necessary.
General Thurman's new plan is based on using overwhelming force. That way, you minimize the casualties on both sides by convincing the defense not to resist.
We knew there was a buildup going on because of the variety and number of units, which included Delta operators, Rangers, Special Forces, 7th ID. You could tell it was a buildup.
Because of the terms of the Carter-Torrijos treaties, the U.S. could move military assets in and out of the Canal Zone more or less at will. So this was a handy way to build up for an invasion of Panama because we could simply say we're bringing in more troops for exercises. It was also a handy way to provoke the Panamanians and cause incidents that would then escalate into U.S. intervention.
The United States had a contingency plan for invading Panama that it hoped it wouldn't have to use. All it would take would be a trigger event, and that event soon came.
December 16, 1989. 4 off-duty U.S. military officers arrive at a PDF checkpoint in Panama City. PDF guards order the Americans out of the vehicle, pointing their rifles at the servicemen. The Americans speed off, and shots ring out.
A shot hit one of the officers, and while the driver tried to find a hospital, the officer bled to death.
When news of these events reaches the U.S., it quickly sets spark to the powder keg, and the military springs into action.
After that, everything went into warp drive. Troop leading procedures went into effect. We had target folders. We started issuing ammunition. It was get that stuff issued now.
The invasion of Panama has the primary objective of restoring order and stability, but it also requires bringing one man to justice, a man so far dug in and protected by his own influence and power that major military action is required to take him down. Noriega has linked his fate to the fate of his loyal military followers, much like more recent American targets, Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. When despotic leaders place their own people between themselves and international justice, open war is often the result. But war is costly. It comes only after diplomatic options have been exhausted. In Panama, we know of several attempts to quietly redirect Noriega or, as a last resort, seek his removal from power. But Noriega has been connected to the very diplomats and intelligence community that now seek his removal. He's able to bluff, prevaricate, delay, and frustrate every peaceful effort to deal with the situation. Under the hard scrutiny of hindsight, tough questions are asked of statecraft and of war. For example, why should foreign leaders who are known personalities be given preferential treatment over less well-known, but perhaps more authentic and principled leaders? Why do national leaders regularly foster questionable alliances attempting to further their country's interests, even at great risk to their nation's image and integrity? One telling quote attributed to President Franklin Roosevelt, speaking about a U.S.-backed dictator in Nicaragua, states, "He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch." Well, friendships built on such necessity and convenience rarely stand the test of time, even if they may serve the purposes of the moment.
As the steady stream of bombs and manpower takes out critical targets, Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega scrambles to safety. In just one night, the American military obliterates Panama's frontline defenses and seizes all major access points in and out of the country. From coast to coast, U.S. troops hunt for Noriega and execute the operation's most urgent, outstanding objectives. On December 20th, 1989, President Bush addresses the nation.
And that is why I directed our armed forces to protect the lives of American citizens in Panama and to bring General Noriega to justice in the United States.
Through the smoke and noise of the initial assault, a Delta Force chopper team is inbound to Carcel Modelo prison. Their high-priority mission is the rescue of American political prisoner Kurt Muse. Muse, who's been illegally broadcasting anti-Noriega messages inside Panama, is being held in solitary confinement. A guard is posted at his cell door, a guard with orders to kill the prisoner if any rescue attempt is made.
Kurt Muse was the only American in their maximum security facility, and saving his life became the most important task to start the operation.
The prison goes black. Muse sits alone in the dark, hearing only the sounds of rockets careening into the commandancia next door. Suddenly, shots ring out, and the guard drops to the ground.
Muse, is that you?
Yes!
Get back to the door, we're gonna fly!
Blasting the cell door off its hinges, the Delta Force grabs Muse and rushes him to the roof. As they lift off, their helicopter is hit by enemy fire and plunges to the street below. Muse and his rescuers are alive, but injured. In a dark alley, they take up defensive positions and wait.
The relief force immediately rolled. They retrieved Muse, they retrieved the Delta men, and they retrieved the aviators and moved them to safety immediately.
With Kurt Muse safe, General Thurman turns his attention to the steady stream of incoming reports from his other objectives. At the top of the list is the capture of Manuel Noriega.
An integral part of Operation Just Cause is the capture of Noriega himself. I mean, he's the trophy buck. He's the guy you can bring back to the States as Exhibit A, that crime doesn't pay, that drug running doesn't pay, that tyranny doesn't pay. And so a Navy SEAL team is detailed to destroy his private jet, destroy his yacht, essentially ground him in Panama so he can be hunted down and captured.
As the dictator runs, a change of leadership takes place. On a U.S. base in the Canal Zone, Guillermo Endara, the opposition candidate in the canceled May presidential election, is sworn in as Panama's new president.
This ceremony was really a fig leaf to cover up the fact that we were invading Panama to overthrow Noriega. The president was sworn in so he could invite us to invade the country, but also he was leader of the democratic forces in the previous year, and it put us on the side of preserving democracy against the dictatorship.
This small ceremony closes the book on Noriega's 6 years of political dominance over Panama. The invasion force continues its offensive. After a long standoff at Fort Amador, Panamanian infantry forces surrender their position to the American invaders. Noriega is not among the prisoners, but inside the fort, U.S. troops rifle through his personal effects, building clues as to his whereabouts. As Rangers clear and search the commandancia in Panama City, U.S. General Thurman eagerly awaits news of Noriega's capture. By midnight of the 22nd, 2 days after the invasion begins, all 27 U.S. tactical objectives are secure. Under tremendous political scrutiny, American commanders rapidly changed the invasion's rules of engagement.
The problem was that in one instance you could be a hero, and then the same act could be then ultimately construed as a war crime, just because the rules of engagement changed.
PSYOPs, Psychological Operations Forces, work to minimize casualties as troops continue to encounter sporadic fighting. These specially trained Spanish-speaking Americans advise Panamanians that further resistance is pointless.
We would have the psychological operations loudspeakers attached to each unit, yell out and tell the defenders to surrender. If they didn't come out, we'd engage them with machine guns. Then we'd yell in again, come on out. The intent was always minimum casualties on either side.
As U.S. troops bring order to urban areas, some PDF remain at large in the countryside. Organized into small garrisons called quartels, they've not yet witnessed the full force of Operation Just Cause.
One of the American officers called a Panamanian defense officer he knew and asked him if he had seen the TV. And he said, "We're coming for you. You have two choices. You can stand and fight and get crushed like the others, or you can come out and surrender." This worked. That tactic spread, and we had no resistance at all.
Rural military operations eventually net the capture of 14 quartels, 2,000 troops, and over 6,000 weapons, signifying the complete deconstruction of Noriega's defense force. The American people are riveted by every turn in the ongoing search for Noriega.
We justified the invasion as bringing to justice a drug trafficker who had attacked U.S. citizens and who is causing instability in an area very important to U.S. security. Noriega was at large, even though all of the other resistance in the country had been suppressed. So the last thing that had to be done was to capture Noriega.
Then on Christmas Eve, there's a dramatic development. Noriega surfaces.
After 4 days of ducking from one safe house to the next, Manuel Noriega seeks asylum at the Vatican Embassy in Panama City. Bound by church law, the Monsignor has no choice but to protect the renegade leader.
Under international law, you cannot enter an embassy. Doing so is, in effect, invading that nation.
The embassy is surrounded by U.S. forces. The United States government pressures the Vatican to surrender the general. Director of the Vatican Press Office, Joaquin Navarro-Valls, responds. He reaffirms that in accordance with church law, Noriega will not, under any circumstances, be turned over to the Americans. With the world watching and the Panamanian public reeling in the wake of invasion, Noriega stares down the Americans, trapped but still defiant.
By deploying nearly 30,000 troops and following a principle of simultaneity, striking everywhere at once, U.S. forces dominate any potential resistance and ensure the successful invasion of Panama. There were two remaining issues: catching Noriega and minimizing civilian casualties. Following the initial assault, the situation in Panama becomes very difficult for these U.S. troops on the ground. The Panamanian police force, run by the PDF, disappears. U.S. troops now find themselves dealing with widespread looting and lawlessness throughout the country. They are forced to step into a constabulary role for which they've not been properly trained nor equipped. Their rules of engagement change constantly and unpredictably. It's confusing, difficult, and costly, and becomes a major lessons learned of the operation. Dating back to ancient times, occupying soldiers often become the custodians of state infrastructure and standing government policy until a new permanent administration can be established. The courtesy and care that these troops exhibit when dealing with the local populations is sometimes as important as the military successes that bring them there. An occupying force's decisions can have profound consequences on the future of the state and the story of its people. It's a tricky business. Its tone is set not only by the brand of justice delivered to defeated leaders, but also by the welfare and opportunities provided to the local population.
Deposed dictator Manuel Noriega, his army defeated and all means of escape destroyed, has been hiding in the Vatican Embassy in Panama City since December 24, 1989. International law prohibits any trespass on embassy grounds. Americans view Noriega's capture as vital to the success of Operation Just Cause.
As soon as Noriega enters the embassy, we establish a cordon around it and then begin talking to the embassy officials about how to secure Noriega's willing departure.
Well, the CIA, from their long relationship with Noriega, knew that he hated rock music, and so they picked the most obnoxious, loudest, heavy metal rock music, and they played it from speakers deployed around the papal legation at full volume in the hopes that it would drive Noriega out of the building or would cause his papal host to throw him out of the building.
The sounds of blaring rock music, helicopters, and protesting citizens echoes through the city streets for days on end. Inside the embassy, Monsignor Jose Laboa speaks at length with a cornered general. Still, the new year comes and goes without any sign that Noriega is ready to surrender. As they wait, the U.S. troops transition into their role as nation builders, establishing law and order for Guillermo Endara's new democratic government.
Our mission was to try to legitimize the new government. We distributed flyers and leaflets that praised the new government, that things would be returning to normalcy, that there would be free elections, those sorts of things. It's military marketing, and you're trying to change the attitude and behavior of a population.
Back in the United States, psyops of a different sort are taking place.
Popular support, not surprisingly, never fell below 80% for this venture because we were attacking tyranny, we were attacking human rights abuses, we were attacking drug dealing, organized crime, and corruption.
Few Americans question the legality of the invasion or the charges leveled against Noriega, a foreign head of state. The majority of American news stories focus solely on U.S. military accolades and casualties. Coffins draped in red, white, and blue dominate television screens throughout the 1989 holiday season.
When the invasion took place, they were watching the troops move in and cheering on the American invasion. They were not aware, however, of how Panamanians were suffering by the impact of the invasion.
Of all the discrepancies in the media, none are so drastic as the reports on Panamanian civilian casualties.
U.S. estimates 200-300. Panamanian UN estimates much higher, between 1,000 and 5,000. So there was a feeling that the civilians were neglected in this campaign.
Before the year is out, the United Nations votes 75-20 with 40 abstentions to condemn the invasion of Panama as a violation of international law. The results receive little or no coverage on American primetime news networks. On January 3, 1990, with little warning, and for reasons known only to himself, Manuel Noriega appears outside the Nunciature building. Carrying a Bible in his hands, he slowly approaches the U.S. troops waiting at the embassy gates. As he steps within reach of the American perimeter, Noriega is forced to the ground. His wrists are taped behind his back, and U.S. troops rush the prisoner to a waiting helicopter. Within half an hour, he's handed over to the DEA. On January 12, 1990, Operation Just Cause officially ends. It's the culmination of a policy of enforcement and influence which began as the dream of one commander-in-chief and carried forward by another nearly 90 years later. The military and political precedents set by these events still resonate throughout U.S. foreign policy today.
In Panama, we used for the first time what has been known as the Steiner Doctrine. This calls for fast in, fast out, the use of overwhelming force, thereby convincing the enemy to surrender rather than resist.
I believe that there were a lot of lessons learned coming out of Operation Just Cause that were applied later on. And in fact, when I redeployed into the first Desert Shield, Desert Storm, where we vilified Saddam Hussein after just getting done vilifying Manuel Noriega. But the two similarities in the operation was that when it's time to go, it's time to go. And you do so with absolute, overwhelming military power, the application of force.
Manuel Noriega is convicted on 8 counts of drug trafficking, racketeering, and money laundering. He's sentenced to 40 years in an American jail. For Panama, the result of the invasion and the removal of the dictator has an historic outcome. On December 31st, 1999, after more than a century of occupation, the last vestiges of a permanent U.S. military presence in the tiny nation are withdrawn. The canal, at last, belongs to the Panamanians.
Even today, in the face of much international and domestic criticism, the United States maintains strength and decisiveness in its pursuit of its interests and its promotion of Western values around the world. In politics, as in war, nothing's ever simple, and it often takes the force of a strong personality or a world leader to shape the outcomes which now define our shared history. The story of Panama is one of many powerful personalities. From President Theodore Roosevelt to Manuel Noriega to President George H.W. Bush, the words and actions of these men still echo in our global political landscape. Good leaders learn from those who've gone before, and it's especially true in war. The wars of today and tomorrow are fought with the ghosts of the past lingering close at hand, crying out the lessons to be learned.